You must have wondered what's the difference between two very similar terminologies. For example, Usulih and Akhbari. Whenever we look at the history of jurisprudence, we find that there tends to be a discussion between two known schools of jurisprudence in Shia Islam, one being the Usuli and one being the Akhbari. Today, we don't find the school of Akhbarism having many proponents, and it's the school of Usulism which has pretty much taken over and governs the way in which we extrapolate and understand law. As can be understood by the names, the Akhbaris were individuals who relied heavily on text, not necessarily the Quran, but mainly the Ahadith. They would see the Quran in light only of the Ahadith. When a Hadith corroborated the apparent meaning of the Quran, they would accept it. On the other hand, the Usulis understood that there are principles, intellectual principles that we can use to derive and extrapolate understandings from the Quran. Although we normally speak about these two groups when it comes to fiqh and jurisprudence, we must understand that the way and the framework in which they approach traditions and the Quran will also affect their understanding when it comes to theology and other aspects of the religion. When these different frameworks approach texts such as the Quran or Hadith, we find that the Akhbari would accept all the different traditions that have come from the Holy Prophet and his family, whereas the Usulis would filter through these traditions, apply different principles in order to understand the veracity of different traditions. When it comes to something which is prohibited, for example, the Akhbaris would take the initial stance of ihtiyat, of precaution, that if something is an unknown matter, then we must take precaution against it. Whereas the Usulis, using their principles, would say that if we exert effort to understand whether something is permissible or not, and if we find that there are no indications in the Quran or the Hadith, then we take the stance of bara'ah, in which we say that we can act upon it, we can indulge in this action, because we realize that if God wanted us to refrain from it, He would have given us an indication to it. Even when it comes to the sources of law, we find that the Akhbaris and Usulis differ. The Akhbaris believe that the Quran can be accepted, the Ahadith, the traditions of the Holy Prophet and his family, are acceptable, and also ijma', consensus between the ulama. However, we find that the Usulis differ. They say not only is it the Quran, the Hadith, ijma', but also the intellect can be used as a source of law. It's for this reason that the Usulis have principles which they use in order to extrapolate law, something we know as ijtihad today, which the Akhbaris would disregard. It's for that reason that the marja'iyya only began at the time of the Usulis and was not present at the time of the Akhbaris. Despite these differences within these frameworks, we must realize that till today, despite being Usulis, we rely heavily on the great ulama that came from the Akhbari school of thought. We must realize their endeavors and their struggles and respect what they have been able to produce for us to use today. Some of the great Akhbari ulama were the likes of Sheikh Yusuf al-Bahrani, the proponent of Akhbarism, Mullah Muhsin Fayd al-Kashani, and also Allam al-Majlisi, the compiler of Bihar al-Anwar.